Dr. Rabi. He studies literacy and rhetorical practices in multilingual communities with a focus on Bangladeshi and Bengali Muslims. He's currently researching transnational rhetorical and literacy practices enacted in digital contexts, such as Substack and WhatsApp. Today, he will tell us how in his book, he traces the rhetorical aspect of the political struggle over the Bangla language that began in 1947. So why 1947? That's a very, very important year for us in the subcontinent. To provide you with the historical context, the Indian subcontinent gained independence from British rule in 1947. And however, when the British left, they divided the country. They divided the land into three parts based on religion. Pakistan on the west side with a Muslim majority, India in the center with a Hindu majority, and East Bengal on the east side, again with a Muslim majority. This was a very, very political act. And what Dr. Rabi is going to say, in the next few minutes, you will see how the language movement became political in this context. So the Indian state of Bengal on the east side was broken up into West Bengal that stayed with India because it had a Hindu majority, and East Bengal was given to Pakistan because of its Muslim majority. So Bangladesh in the middle with the northeastern states on one side and West Bengal on the other, and Bangladesh is sandwiched in the middle because of Muslim majority. However, the people in the eastern part of Bengal wanted Pakistan to recognize Bangla as one of its state languages. And Pakistan was, of course, not willing because they wanted Urdu. So that's how the language movement turned political, eventually becoming a full-blown freedom movement. Then, of course, the rest is history. In 1971, the India-Pakistan War happened, and India helped East Pakistan, as it was called at that time, become independent. So that provides the context for Dr. Rabi's chronotopic framework to study the Bangla language movement. In simple words, it's a study of time and space within which the movement took place. The eastern part of Bengal had 3 name changes in a span of just 24 years. From Bengal, which was in undivided India, it became East Bengal in 1947 after partition, to East Pakistan in 1955, to finally Bangladesh in 1971 as an independent country. And the common denominator in three of these names is Bangla, or Bengal, the language that was spoken there. So you might ask, how do I know all this? Because I'm also from Bengal and I speak Bengali, but I'm from the India part of Bengal. The Eastern and Western versions of the language are kind of different with distinct intonations. The Indian version retains its Sanskrit roots, while the Bangladeshi version over time integrated loan words from Persian, Arabic, and Hindustani. What is Hindustani? It's the shared linguistic base of Hindi and Urdu languages. Urdu, which is again spoken in Pakistan. So with that introductory information, I now invite Dr. Rabi to tell us more about his book and how he traces the rhetorical aspect of the Bangla language movement. Dr. Rabi.
Thanks, Dr. Biswas, for this great introduction and this fantastic primer about the history. I think, that's always such a complicated history because there's so many nuances there. And that was always one of the main challenges when trying to present on this work, because you're like, what are you talking about? Are you talking about Pakistan, Bangladesh, India? There's overlapping names continuously because of the complicated nature. And which Bangla are you talking about? Are you talking about West Bengali, Promito standard, or Bangladeshi standard? What does that mean? Isn't it the same register? Isn't it mutually intelligible? Yes, but the connotations are different. So it's always a lot of complications, but I thank you for this great primer. And audience, thanks for attending today. And listening to my talk about this study, and I will sort of go into some of the granular things Dr. Biswas talked about as well, from 47 to 56, the language movement, how it created sort of a sense of a people, as rhetoricians might call it, through this topos of language. So my talk today is based on, is there a way I can just share? There's a section, portion of the screen I should be able to. If I can keep my notes. Are people looking at the screen?
Yes,
we can
yes.
see it.
Okay, great. So the title of my talk today, and is it legible? I hope it is legible. All
Yes.
these. Okay, fantastic. So the title of my talk today is what global rhetoric looks like when language is at stake. If that is sort of the argument being made. Rhetoric as sort of a communicative system, or global rhetoric, or as Dr. Lloyd, one of the founders of this group, says, it's a doing of how things work, how communication is done. So what does it look like when the idea of language is at stake in a given rhetorical situation? The way I understand this and the way I looked at it here is these two sort of frameworks conceptually. One is the idea of rhetorical sovereignty, and the other framework is the framework of language ideology. Those are sort of the two concepts I thought fit given the topic I was looking at, which was a language movement and a language rights movement in what is then East Pakistan and what is now Bangladesh. And the two concepts here, one is the well-known one by Scott Lyons, or Lyons, which is rhetorical sovereignty, the inherent right of people to decide for themselves the goals, the modes, the styles, and languages of public discourse. And the second is language ideology. This is more a side to rhetorical studies. It is more in social linguistics and linguistics. That is the idea of what language is, what people believe about their language, what other people's languages, and the situated forms they talk, they deploy, the material effects, the social, economic, environmental of such views and uses of language as a materiality, as sort of a functional dimension in the world. Those are two distinct definitions or conceptual apparatus in these two fields, rhetoric and social linguistics. And given the topic, it's talking about rhetorical sovereignty, and it's talking about concepts of language within this idea of rhetorical sovereignty in Bangladesh at that time. These are the sort of definitional things I work with. The reason I sort of work with this is within this idea of rhetorical sovereignty, there's a tacit assumption that is there that assumes the people who are deciding for themselves the goals, the modes, the styles, the languages. But one of the things about constitutive rhetoric and even sort of language ideology or social linguistic aspects of language is it isn't just communicative, it isn't just encoding. The very act of language, the very act of creating communicating creates the person who is communicating something. So what is in Scott Lyon's concept, the people are assumed a priority. But language ideology, one of the things, and even the constitutive nature of languages, the people are also constituting themselves while they're encoding their information of sovereignty through this idea of language. So this movement for me was a very useful case study to examine this process, because East Pakistan, or the people of East Pakistan, Bengali Muslims, came to see themselves as a people demanding language that is Bangla, while they're considering the idea of Bangla as sort of a language, and the people themselves as the people who speak Bangla in a distinct way from West Bengalis. This happened through this process. That's one of my arguments. So it is both encoding, language as encoding system, language as constitutive system in this mass movement process. So that's what I wanted to look at through this movement over the period of 10 years through using the corpus method. And I think Dr. Biswas provided a really great primer, but I'll just do this here. When partition happened in 1947, and India, the British Raj system, the subcontinent, was broken into Pakistan and India. The map was like this. You have West Pakistan, you have East Pakistan, and this is now Bangladesh. And the demographics around that time of Pakistan is here. So you have the majority speakers, 42 million over here. Punjabi speakers, 22 million, majority here. All the total population was 79 million, these two wings. But the majority, absolute majority, was Bangla speakers over here. But the rest were sort of broken down. But even within this debate about what would be the state language, because Urdu was sort of the language of the elite class, the muhajirs, they wanted to use that as the lingua franca for all of it. Their argument was because it's such a multi-ethnic, multilingual nation, there's no singular commonality. The way we can create this constitutiveness of the nation and nationalism was having this one language that was the native language of no one, which is Urdu. So it wouldn't necessarily be Punjabi, which is the majority population here. It won't be Bangla, which is the majority population here. Their argument is like, we will use Urdu because it is the majority population of no one. That was their lingua franca argument. But over that process, because language became sort of a symbol of all the sort of other ways of exploitation, chauvinism, and expropriation that was happening, it became the rhetorical topos space within which all of the political struggle in East Pakistan came to congeal and make it a political movement about the demand for a state language, mother language recognition, which was Bangla. So it ran from 1947 to 56 within the parameters of my study, because in 56, they did officially recognize Bangla and Urdu as the two state languages of Pakistan in the constitution. And initially, the initial proposal in 48 in the initial drafting of the constitution and the various process was just going to be Urdu. And then you would have local regions, East Pakistan or West Pakistan, designate their own state language and in the region. But throughout the process, by the end, it was designated the state language would be Urdu and Bangla in both things. That was the sort of victory of the movement. But in that process, it, as I say here, was a mass movement that emerged to push for state language recognition of the mother language of the Bengalis, which is the majority population, and constituted the Bengali Muslims into a modern imagined community and laid the foundations of Bangladeshi independence in 1971. So this is some of the arguments in literature that the people came to see themselves from being Bengali Muslims to Muslim Bengalis and a nation in the modern concept of the word through this movement from 1947 to 56. And then it became a full-fledged independent nation in 71. 14 years after this thing ended. So that was sort of the historical thing. Now, my argument here, the main point here is this idea of chronotopic negotiations, that is the time space as a resource, how chronotopes are representation of time and space within an argument or within discourse. And what I'm sort of going to try and talk about today, using examples from this study that I did, is this idea of chronotopic negotiations as languages being represented. That is the chronotopes around this argument of Bangla. And I'll use one case study specifically. There's arguments for Urdu in the book as well that represent the language in a specific time space configuration. That is a chronotope, and what that makes legible, and what that legitimation makes powerful and rhetorical concept. So my main thesis there is the language movement was successful in that as it was because it didn't necessarily invent a new language ideology completely, because I don't think that is an effective rhetorical strategy. It worked because it negotiated the three extant ideologies that identify as already existing in the space. Traditional, which in this case is Islamic; modern, which in this case is functional, state building; third, folk, the sort of culture, folk culture of Bangladesh. those are the three major ideologies I identify, and each of those ideologies had certain conceptualization of language built within it. And I'm arguing in the book that the language movement was able to successfully negotiate itself in these three ideologies and brought with it each of those semiotic systems from each of them to make the overall discourse and the rhetoric of the language movement more effective. And these ideologies were thus, again, defined in a certain way, a kairotic affordance. So it is not necessarily an a priori one, but it emerges and is immanent within that moment, the temporal moment of kairos, and around rhetorical sovereignty. So it isn't that a people exist and they're demanding something, but a people exist kairotically through time, through space, and they're constituted in that moment, in that situational moment, and they demand that thing. And in that process of demanding that thing, they also substantiate themselves and reiterate themselves, and not necessarily reify, but add dimensions because of the sort of reiteration process. This is what makes it powerful and successful rhetorically. Like, this is why I'm arguing that the language movement was so effective in that moment of 1948 to 56 to create a people out of what was at that moment not necessarily one. And one way I'm saying we can see this, and specifically as rhetorical scholars, is seeing the chronotopic representation of language that is happening again and again and again in different iterations through the traditional, the modern, and the folk. In the book, I talk about all three, each their sections to it. Today, I will only like really use a chart to talk about one, the modern one. And we can have more questions in the Q&A. And if you have questions, we can unpack it there. So before one of the methods I use for that, I'm just going to do a little step back and talk about some of the digital humanities methods and close reading methods that I use. So the distant reading approaches and the close reading approaches, that was how I dealt with the big sort of corpus of data that was there. And the DH methods, the digital humanities methods, basically, I had a corpus of about 250, and you'll see it, words from a decade worth of newspaper articles, speeches, official records, all of this stuff in different languages. I did translate that in different ways, using machines for the words, but also changing it up because I understood the original Bangla in a certain way. And the purpose of that was to look at it through distant reading methods. And the way I did that, and what that basically meant for me, was to turn data, the text into data, data into visuals, and visuals into interpretation. And those created certain charts and graphs that were the foundations through which I organized my research. And the point of this was these distant readings helped me create a heuristics which would shape and limit my hermeneutics. So I wouldn't read outside of what the visuals were. And this sort of allowed me to check my own bias, or sort of limit my own bias. And we can have that discussion, because I'm Bangladeshi. I was born in Bangladesh. I was raised in Bangladesh. I was raised in an ethos of Bangladeshi nationalism. And the idea of Urdu as sort of a language was very alien to me, even though my parents, they both spoke Urdu when they were growing up, because they were taught it in school. And anyone from that generation were illiterate in Bangla, Urdu, English, if they went through schooling system. Whereas for me, Urdu is like a completely alien language. I wouldn't understand it. I don't think of it as part of the space. So that automatically biased myself into this argument, whether or not Urdu demands was legitimate or not, or whether it was over-determinative. And the DH methods helped me see that, yeah, there was a sense of legitimate demand for it in Bangladesh at that time. There was also a legitimate demand for Pakistan as a separate state in Bangladesh in 48 too. You can just see it in the sentiments of the people talking in the records. So that sort of checked my own bias growing up as I did in the Bangladeshi nationalism context. I supplemented that with close reading things. That is, I use transnational and translingual close reading methods to understand how language function in that context. So things such as stylistic inventories, facts of usage and non-usage, to use Toomey Mao's concept that a lot of us here will be familiar with. and then meta-discursive moments and materiality of text to get at the close reading of what was actually being done there. And those things all together help me sort of see the sort of centripetal forces in a text, how it's pushing for a consolidated view of a language, and then also the heterogeneous view of language, centrifugal forces happening at the same time. Okay. So the distant regions converted, as I said, overall history, and it created these three, this is what I'll talk about next. The three visualizations that it created was word cloud for lexical frequencies, a line graph that showed the big picture, and the semantic worknet. So this would be the chronotope I'll get to in a second. And again, it was about interrupting my bias in there. So the first one that is useful to look at is the work, I created a word cloud, and a lot of us have done this, is it took the corpus of all the genres that were there from 47 to 56. And I did work to make it not just unigrams but bigrams. I tried trigrams as well, like that is 3-word phrases, but those weren't necessarily useful. So I ended up doing unigrams and I combined them into bigrams that were meaningful. And I got the sort of top 39 words. I think it's 39 here in terms of frequency. And one of the things that jumps out at me when I did this process, okay, I have all of this. There are two registers of things going on here. One, the words are talking about languages, and this other is talking about social collectives, like political units. So if you break down the sort of top 39 words in sort of proper nouns, people who are talking about things, they're talking about languages and they're talking about political units. So you can see the mass movement corpus is constituted around two topics: language and political units. So you can sort of see the collective noun, the people, East Bengal, East Pakistan, public. This is the constitutive nature of the political nature of that movement. They're demanding political rights, they're demanding states' rights, they're demanding political representation. And the other term here is about language. What is official language? What is state language? What is a national language? What is Bangla, Urdu, all of these things. So you can see the top words, what is the makeup of this discourse? Just as sort of a pure positivistic, here are the terms, what are they about in proper nouns, unigrams or bigrams. These are the two topics of the conversation: political units and language units. That sort of, it's not just the demand when we talk about language movement as a demand for language, it is also a political thing. It's manifesting here in terms of the two topics. And that is obvious because of the sort of simplification that distant reading makes possible. And once I have this, I turn them into discursive fields. That is, each of discursive field: democracy, Islamic nationalism, language movements, lingua franca, each of these 4 categories, and we can talk about this in the Q&A as well, that led me to the sort of chronotopes I created later, were made up of the certain words here. So language movement would be made up of Bangla. These are the themes that constitute in terms of Bangla students, education, literature. Those would be part of the language movement topic theme. So anytime those words appeared, it would get categorized into the corpus as this theme, language movement. And it's not mutually exclusive. So it would happen, word Bangla would be in language movement, it would also be in democracy. State language would be in language movement, but it would also be in lingua franca. They are not mutually exclusive. So having created these 4 discursive field patterns or themes, what it allowed me to do is then look at the frame of the corpus across the 10 years, because it was categorized by year in terms of publications and the records, how these themes move through the time frame. That is, you have these 4: democracy, Islamic nationalism, language movement, lingua franca. These thematics, if you look at the corpus of the event from 56 to 47 to 56, they sort of move up and down in terms of the salience, in terms of the percentage of the words in the overall discourse. So this is 8, I don't know if it's clear, and 0. So each of these, again, help me see the events of history. That is after the fact. 47, independence and partition happens. Announcement of Urdu as lingua franca in Pakistan, formation of student organizations in East Bengal, East Pakistan, to sort of push back against it and start demanding Bangla as a state language. So this is this era. So you can sort of see these discursive fields or thematic sort of happening. So you go an upsurge of Islamic nationalism and lingua franca debates right here. It's an independence moment, so obviously Islamic nationalism will have its moment. So it's more of a percentage. And then demand for Bangla as a state language happens here. It starts sort of splitting apart. And then protesters, which is the big event that happens where people protest for state language, security forces shoot at a crowd, kill a bunch of people, and sets up a mass movement across the East Pakistan at all levels of society. So within that moment, you can see right now, this Islamic nationalism and democracy as a field is pretty even. But after that, this drops off precipitously. So demands for Urdu in the discourse as the soul, Islamic nationalism, discourses as Islamic nationalism also tapers off, and the language movement and democracy sort of move up, and it separates itself very fundamentally. So the corpus itself shows that these topics were less talked about explicitly in those terms after that, because the sentiment had changed so much because of that field. But at the same time, this is where, because it was so similar here, these things show, and some of the record has shown, that there was legitimate demand for Urdu, there was legitimate demand for Pakistan at a certain moment in East Pakistan. But it moved away because of the perceived chauvinism of the West. So those are the sort of distant reading things. Then the traditional ideologies, modern ideologies, and the folk ideologies, the chronotopes that I'm working with. So traditional ideologies is Islamic in that Bangladeshi context. That is language of the Ummah. The most important thing is language that will help Islam Bangladesh be part of the global order. Local speech is, again, not about local speech, it's about how Islamic values can be communicated using local language. So what is the most Islamic language? That is the language that will be the language of the local space. Those are traditional ideologies in my framework. The language of martyrdom, which picks up later and which I talk about in the book, that is also specifically a language of Islamic valence in my argument. The modern language ideologies, language of education, language of technological efficiency, the mixed language of the local space. So the idea of modernity, that languages are not global, but they're local space things, just like nationalism is the sort of Herderian triad of people, language, space. The geography, all three of them are that. So that is the modern concept of language. And it is the mixed language, not necessarily the pure language of, let's say, Bangla qua Bangla, Latin qua Latin, but French for here, Italian for here, and that itself is mixed from the sort of lingua franca of the order space. So if Sanskrit was the lingua franca or Farsi was the lingua franca, those mix with the local languages to make a new language, which in this case would be Bangla, is a mix of Sanskrit, Pali, all of these things. Folk ideology. So the idea of multiliteracy, so it's multimodal, it's oral, it's not just language. Language doesn't operate just in the discourse, it operates in the materiality, it operates in the semiotics, it operates in terms of the genres. It picks up these monuments, it picks up these cultural practices. So these are all part of the folkness, not necessarily in the modern sense of language. We would see discourse and discursivity as distinct things than the material aspects of semiotics. So those are the three ideologies that I'm sort of working with. So when in the book, I talk about how when people are negotiating these things in the traditional sense, rather than reject the language movement, I found that rather than reject the traditional ideology of Islam as the sort of governing structure, the movement argued within it. That is, it used the Quranic doctrine of linguistic diversity. That is, linguistic pluralism is in the Quran. There is a famous ayat in the Quran that says linguistic difference is a marker of God's will, and that is part of how creation is made. And you want to work with that because that is God's will, which is very different than the Babel myth, where multilingualism is a punishment, it's an aberration. Whereas in the Islamic ideology, multilingualism is manifesting God's intention. So it is nature. It is the sort of kitab al-world, book of the world, book of creation. So it uses that doctrine on linguistic diversity. And then it also uses the martyrdom discourse that is also in there for its rhetorical power. So the people who are killed in 1952 become, at first there were protesters who were killed. Then within a year, they become turned language martyrs, Bhasha Shohids. And that Shohid word is a very specific concept in Islamic discourse. So it takes over that rhetorical power there. So that's a traditional thing. In the modern sense, rather than rejecting modernity, it engaged with hegemonic modern ideologies to fit local plurilingualism. That is, it was proposing Shahaj Bangla, which was a proposal that was made to turn Bangla into sort of a standardized, simplified script system that would be utilized nationally in a more standardized and simplified encoding manner. And it would help functionally make the state work better. That was the argument they were making within that concept, that Bangla was actually more of a modern language than Urdu was because of the scriptural affordances that Urdu didn't have, that Bangla did have. It was all of this stuff. Then third, the folk. So rather than staying in the literate spaces, just operating in like written language and in the language itself, like all mass movements, it operated within the sort of folk tradition of multimodality, or incorporated oral traditions, songs, music, dance, folk music, which is a big part of Bengali culture, and the material symbols around the society, which was the sort of minar, Shohid minar, which was Sriti Stambha at the time, these monuments that incorporated into it as a part of his rhetorical argument. And that made it extend beyond the discursive and extend beyond the sort of language of the intellectuals and the writing systems. And that's what made it a folk, because at the end of the day, it made it a mass movement because at that time only 20% were probably literate. And even then they were like not public spaces. These negotiations help it become a mass movement. Okay, so let's talk about the chronotope stuff. Everyone sort of was able to follow, I hope, what I talked about there. So what I did once I have all of these units was I was able to map this big discourse or these fields, these thematics. I would take those themes, and I don't know if it's legible here. This is always a problem with this sort of thing. Let's see. Sorry. So the nodes are each one of those discursive fields. So this is Bangla. So this is a discursive field that is language. And then you have the other nodes are categorized in different ways. Some of them are language movements, some of them are tagged as language movements, some of them are tagged as Islamic nationalist codes, some of them are tagged as democracy nodes. So I read each of these concepts into the various speeches, important speeches that were given, and I tagged each of them at sentence units, and I sort of counted the level of co-occurrences. So a sentence that talked about Bangla and the sentence at that same moment or the same utterances talked about Bengal. So whenever they were happening at the same time, I co-tagged them, which is, and then because of, once I was able to tag all of these, I sort of counted the co-occurrences of the tags happening in the same unit. And each time they were counted, there was a edge made between it. So Bangla occurred a certain amount of times that made it this size of the node, and Bengal occurred this many times, and in the speech, this made it this size of the node, which is bigger than these sides because they occurred more than these. At the same time, when they co-occurred within the same unit, the edge was thicker because there was counted more, as opposed to, as you can see, these are thinner edges. So what that allowed me to do is really just, again, create a chart like this, create a visualization that counted how many times these utterances co-occurred in a given utterance. And it might be positive, it might be negative, but it showed when people are talking about this, they co-occurred with this. And those co-occurrences, and that allowed me to create this graph, this network graph. And once I had this network graph, I was able to place it in terms of local space, distance space, universal space, local time, distance space. So this is a chronotope. This is within a given speech, a chronotopic representation. When Bangla is being talked about, it co-occurs with Bengal, it co-occurs with independence, it co-occurs with modernity. And that is a chronotopic representation. Modernity as a universal value, Bangla as the language of space, which is the local space and local and contemporary time rather than distant time, which in this case would be Hindustan would be in a distant time. It's a local space, but it's going back 1,000 years. When it's referring to Bangla as the language of Hindustan, it will refer to 2, 3, 4, 500 years before in the speech, not necessarily East Bengal or East Pakistan, which would be a more local time. So these sort of representations allowed me to make legible the chronotopic representation of languages. So you can see Bangla, the strongest connections are Bangla and Bengal. So Bengal as a geographic space that is contemporary and local. This is a thick line as opposed to these other ones, which are thinner. Like the edge lines are not as thick as, not as co-occurring as the thick lines or the thin lines. The other one is modernity and the other one is independence. So that's here. Those are concepts in the universal space, but they co-occur with Bangla in thick associations. Here. So you can see the lines there. These are much thicker here between modernity and Bangla. Modernity, Bangla and literature, which is the thickest because it was given at a literature conference, the speech I'm looking at. So these co-occur the most. And then Bangla and Bengal also co-occur substantially because they are sort of the argument being made in that speech is that it is the language of the space. It is language of the region. So this is a chronotopic representation that was given by a famous speaker in during the moment called Dr. Shahidullah, and his entire argument, this visuality makes clear, is the speaker keeps Bangla anchored locally throughout, and this happens again and again from the Bangla language movement corpus, not from the Pakistan corpus. The Urdu corpus does a different move. But the speeches from the language movement, specifically from the experts, are always anchoring it in the local space, in the region, because it's trying to make this argument about being the language of space, the language of the place, and the modern concept, not the language of Islam, which is a transnational space, because they want to make that argument. And they're connecting it to modernity and they're connecting to independence. Both are universal modern values, but they're not necessarily about Islam. They're not necessarily about other senses, but these are modern values being placed. Independence and sort of modernity as sort of functional. Bangla's strongest graph association is with Bengal, and it is language of the space. It is mixed language, mixed with Khol, Persian, Arabic, Portuguese, English. So Bangla has all these traces into it, and which Dr. Biswas also talked about earlier in a great primer, that the Eastern Bangladeshi Bangla has semiotic inputs in there that make it very distinct, semantic input that makes it distinct from West Bengal Bangla, which is the layering of Persian words, the layering of Arabic words in there because of the Islamic values that it wants to identify itself as sort of Bengali Muslims. So those are what is again being stressed. And this mixedness is the essence of the argument that Shahidullah is making for modernity. So that's sort of the chronotopes and what it allows us to do. So the bounded name language can be an act of rhetorical sovereignty, not just colonial inscription. And this is one of the arguments I'm making in the book. A lot of the arguments, some of the arguments that have been made in the translingual sense is that the idea of a name language is always a colonial imposition, that it was invented by the British or the colonialists to create this thing. And Dr. Biswas's point earlier about Hindustani being turned into Urdu and Hindi is one of those, is sort of speaking to some of those distinctions that emerged with British colonialism. Same with Bangla. It emerges in a certain moment in the modern concept. And one of the arguments in translingualism has been that the name language is always seen as a way of primarily managing difference. Bengali Muslims, Bengali Hindus, that idea of difference. But one of the things here that I'm trying to make is that the bounded language is also a resource, a repertoire resource, a semiotic affordance in these acts of agency or rhetorical sovereignty. It isn't just only seen as a colonial imposition, but it is also a way the general population or the society manages to push against power structures within this named language concept. That we speak this, therefore we will have rights inherent to us as speakers of this language. Then the chronotope and scale give us a transportable method that you can watch rhetoricians scale a language up to universal values and also scale down to local values in the same utterance. They're able to say language, Bangla is an inherent language of the people that speaks to universal values of beauty, aesthetics, for literature. At the same time, it's also in the same utterance, they're saying it evokes the language of Dhaka, it evokes the language of the people of this. It's universal and local simultaneously in the same utterance. And they're able to do that with the chronotopic representation they're doing each time. The other thing that I didn't really talk about here is translation is part of the analysis. Because I was working with a multilingual corpus throughout, my act of translation and the machine translation, I had to work with it all the time to see what the analysis is going on here. And to give you an example of this, so this is these are some of in the standard language argument that was made by Shaj Bangla people. They provided a list of ways being, and again, these are caricatures, these are rhetorical examples. They're providing, okay, we have West Bengali Bangla is like this, we will make our Bangla like this. So on the left, and these are not accurate, even the published literature here said like no one talks like this, but they provide these sentences to show certain examples. So one is, I will not forget you even in my reincarnated lives. That's sort of the example of like, I will always remember you. In the West Bengali register that the proposal they were publishing showed. And that get translated with, I will not forget you till the day of judgment. The idea is in an Islamic society, reincarnation would be shirk, would be anathema, would be not acceptable because it's not, reincarnation is not part of Islamic dogma. So that gets translated into, I will forget you to the end of judgment. So these translations are always happening in that sort of arguments people are making in that moment. When they're trying to even shift between the language within Bangla, that they're saying West Bengali is like this, East Pakistani Bangla is like this. They're making these like rhetorical concepts and translation is happening across them. And these are rhetorical translations. These are acts of agency, choices being made for purposes. So that is what I sort of mean when we say translation itself is rhetorical and a step before the analysis. I had to do the same thing when I was translating certain words here, the concepts here. This speech is based on a Bangla speech, which I then translated, and then I counted the translations word in English. So though that was an act I myself did before I did this stuff. So all of this is an act in the analysis, and those things have to be accounted for in the sort of acts of rhetorical activities. So just in terms of my overall argument, as I said, it's as a chronotope, we can see how rhetoric or global rhetoric works with these extant ideologies, which could be global or local in different ways, whether they're traditional, modern, and folk, and they operate in these concepts of chronotopic lamination, chronotopic like representation, how they represent space, how they represent time in any given utterances. When any topic is being talked about, whether it's Bangla, English, in the language sense, it's evoking space, it's evoking time spaces in certain configurations. Local time, local space, local time, distance space, and then universal spaces. And one of my arguments, which I found useful while I was analyzing this stuff, is this concept of chronotopic representation. What you can do when you read the text in these ways. And how certain languages are said not a priori created, but constituted, and they're constituted in this configuration specifically that I found in the language movement, chronotopic configurations. And the utility of that in terms of global rhetoric, how when people are talking about global rhetoric or non-Western rhetoric or contrastive rhetorics, when people are, this idea of chronotope representation can be utilized in different ways that ties the local global in different configurations when they're trying to when people are trying to understand this. The same way the concept of discursive field, Louis Ma talks about so well in the words associations across different concepts when you're trying to understand translated concepts into global rhetoric. This sort of chronotopic representation that's happening within arguments is also something I would argue is very useful to look at when we're trying to understand non-Western rhetoric's frameworks in a way that makes it legible to the field. So that's sort of my spiel. I know I ran over, I'm sorry. And it comes from this book, which hopefully will be out on the 14th. It's called The Language Movement in Bangladesh, Translingualism and the Struggle for Rhetorical Sovereignty. So thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rabbi. And any questions? No questions? Oh, I see lots of applause.
I've just included a question in the chat from one of the registration forms. It's from Gideon Kwakuhumi. How is chronotopic negotiation different from chronotopic lamination? Is chronotopic negotiation solely theory, or does it have pedagogical implications in teaching writing?
That's a great question from Gideon. Right. Is he here?
I don't think Gideon is in the meeting.
Okay. So I think the way, full disclosure, Gideon is at Virginia Tech. He's one of our grad students, and he's working with this idea of chronotopic lamination in his dissertation work. So the way we've been thinking about it, because I work with him closely, is this lamination aspect, how it's sedimenting things on top of things, as opposed to the negotiation is within that situation, within that moment, whatever that discursive field is. Whereas the lamination happens, in my concept, let's say from Monday to next Sunday, like a temporal time from here, it gets laminated on top. The negotiation happens on the moment of the Monday, like when you're talking in that situational space as an analytical thing. It's lamination, negotiation is part of lamination, but lamination happens not chronologically, but through time. It's continuously happening like this, on top, underneath, whichever. Whereas the negotiation frame looks at the instantiation, like the given moment, the give and take of that communicative act, rather than the temporal long-term act. Both are acts of representation, though, how they're configuring time space in a certain way, which I try to make legible through that chart I use. I don't know what others would think about that answer.
Well, I was thinking about negotiation and lamination, and um, we've had literature from pre-independence times. We've had the Bengali literature by Rabindranath Tagore, Kazi Nazrul Islam, and I'm guessing the way these writers are read on the two sides of the border would, to some extent, represent this whole process of first negotiation and then lamination. Current writers in Bangladesh have probably moved much further ahead with the lamination process. Several layers of lamination have happened to the point where what the literature that comes out of Bangladesh right now is probably very different from the Bangla literature produced in West Bengal, even though at one time it was the same, because without a border, we were all reading the same writers.
Right.
I wonder how, if you still read Rabindranath Tagore and Kazi Nazrul Islam and Bonhoeffer, those writers who existed at the time of partition, if you still read them, and how you negotiate their writing in the current political scenario of Bangladesh.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. When you read Rabindranath Tagore, he's read as the universal poet, right? The speaker of humanity. Whereas Kazi Nazrul Islam, the way we were raised, was read as the Bidrohi Kavi, that is the rebel poet. He talks about struggle against British, all of that stuff, whereas Rabindranath Tagore is universal soul, the aspect of creation. And that how it gets interpreted in the given context. And I think Bangladeshi literature has really shifted radically in the last 25, 30 years. Like Humayun is the classic example. Is sort of, for the first time, there is a canon of Bangladeshi literature that Bangladeshis recognize as distinct than Bengali literature, Bangla literature as such, which is like Humayun Ahmed, Shoidul Zohair, Akhtar Zalaman, Ilyas, all of that thing that is set specifically in the Bangladeshi space rather than the Bengali space, which is a broader like community. That idea, and those have come to be read as a distinct register of Banglaness. Bangla, it sounds different, it speaks different, it uses different words for different things, and the way it frames itself is, I think, definitely nationalistic in a way that distinguishes itself as not West Bengali, but Bangladeshi. It is a key part of Bangladeshi consciousness now, in my opinion, to distinguish itself as, on some register anyway, and socioeconomic classes, between the middle classes, the working classes, the mass population classes, the sort of more and more emphasis on Islam is definitely there as a culture. The more and more emphasis of distinction of not being part of India or being independent of Indian influence is like a big part of it. At the same time, a sort of sense of urbanism abides. I think Bangladeshi literature is very Dhaka-centric in the sense of we exist within the sort of what it means to be a Dhaka citizen as opposed to be a Bangladeshi or Bengali citizen. Because Dhaka is such a huge part of the consciousness of Bangladesh. And this is, again, my bias because I grew up in Dhaka. I'm like endemically like a Dhaka kid. It'll always be the case, and how we distinguish ourselves from being from Calcutta, for example. Those are sort of registered in like language around religion, language around sort of nationalism, languages around the iconography of 1971 is a major one. Like that is a topic that is perennially a topic of every Bangladeshi literature that wouldn't necessarily be a part of Bengali literature.
Yeah, I see Therese has raised her hand.
I do. I think it's no secret that I really appreciate this book and this project. And the concepts of there are three things, Dr. Rabi, that you're doing in your own work that resonate with me. One is the idea of chronotope. You use chronotope to trace discourse, and I use chronotope to trace archival ideology. The other is the argument for translation as invention, which it's neither the beginning point nor the ending point, but the point where the rhetorical work is done. And I thought you articulated those 2 points very well. The third thing is something I appreciate, and I didn't appreciate it when I first heard about your book. I understand it, I think, a little bit more after the presentation, and that's that you are carving out a middle space between rhetorical sovereignty and language ideology. There seems to be a tendency in our field to see those as opposing forces.
Right.
And so I suppose I have kind of a practical question. It's not theoretical at all, and I apologize if it's not eloquent. How difficult was it for you to write a project in that middle space and to sell that idea?
Yeah, that is that has been a very hard move conceptually as well, because like this is a key ends of the field, like the instrumentalist view of language and then the constitutive view of language. Those are two distinct areas, and one side is always saying, okay, we need to have more students' rights to their own language that's constituted in their own community. The other is saying, oh, not speaking other people's tongue or academic language is no one's first language. So it's instrumentalists. Those two areas, and it's always this like struggle. One saying like, oh, for the pragmatic reasons of social justice, we need to recognize students' languages. But the same sort of argument could be made for the sake of social justice. We need to teach students in the academic register so that it is the language of power they can negotiate. So trying to do that has been like perpetually a struggle conceptually, and trying to make that argument within the process and my research has also always been this balancing act. And the end of the day, like the more language is always polysemic, like multiple.
Polysemic.
Polysemic, yes, thank you. Polysemic. It's always instrumentalist, it's always constitutive. You cannot distinguish between those all the time. And I'm always trying to find a way to make that argument, like just coincidentally, like not to plug all of it, like just to say like it's still part of my mind space all the time. Like I'm reading Charles Taylor's like there's the language animal, which is sort of philosophy of language space where, yeah, you have the instrumentalist view of language and constitutive view of language, and language is both, and you have to do both. Rhetorical sovereignty and language ideology has to like be talking about this. And when I tried to make this speak argument in the book, the way I sort of synthesize this, and I think it's in the presentation, maybe I should have emphasized this more, like stabilize for now, like this is the way we treat genre, this concept of stabilize for now, like temporally it's created. The idea of Bangla isn't an essential view of Bangla from ever, the sense of the Bengali soul, but it is a historical, cultural, kairotic affordance that emerges from 47 to 56, that has this traditional register, that has this modern register or valence, and then the folk valence all happening at the same time, that creates this concept of Bangla as a constitutive dimension while also being an instrumentalist dimension, both at the same time. And given those valences happening, they obviously shift. The way they wrote in 1950 is not the way people write now, because the registers of like Islamic valence, the modern valence, the folk valence have all shifted in a very fundamental way. And there's a new valence. We can talk about the digitality valence as well that emerges, that makes it a distinct, stabilized for now as a concept than it was in 1957. And that kairotic affordance that it creates, that balances the instrumentalist or the encoding function of language. I have this idea, I'm going to use Bangla to register, and Bangla is best suited to speak to my sense of being in the world because it's part of the local space there, but also it's constituted because it's part of the local space, having both of those things. And it's always a hard sell. The way I did it is stabilized for now concept and the sort of kairotic affordance of the concept of a named language in an older sort of argument, like the idea of strategic essentialism that Spivak talked about. Whereas I would use more the idea of genre as a stabilized for now, as a kairotic affordance, like the name language of Bangla as a kairotic affordance for arguments of rhetorical sovereignty, while also creating the people who are demanding that thing.
And you use space as well, which I find useful, distant and local. So it's sort of drawing from some of the work that Looming Mao has done, which I find super productive because those identifiers can shift as well. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
thank you.
local, distant, and it's also the scale. That's also in like social linguistics, like local scale, distant scale, high scale, low scale. They're all like simultaneously being. They're so the thing that was really helpful in creating those charts for me, it allowed me to make legible the chronotopic representation that's happening in these ways. Like they're co-occurring here, here, here. They're connected through this edge, and you can see that this is more associated because it's happening more at the same time than this one. And you can place it on these scales in local, distant, high, low, whichever way. And once you see that, you can see how the same argument that's making an argument for Bangla literature is also making an argument for Bangla as a universal value in the same utterance.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Any more thoughts, ideas? Suresh, please go ahead.
I don't have any questions. I just wanted to thank Dr. Rabi for such an insightful presentation. And it was, again, great listening to him. And I would also wish him all the best for his forthcoming book. And it was also really nice to see Dr. Biswas after maybe 5-6 years after, I left UTEP, never had a chance to kind of see with you, meet you in sure this virtual in-person kind of mode. But yes, just wanted to pass on some compliments and thank you people for organizing such great webinar. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, you should consider speaking as well. Talk about Nepal.
Right. Yeah, I think I would really want to do it. And if I have anything of that sort popping up, I will definitely shoot you an email and maybe I'll be able to, talk a bit and share my experiences as well sometime in the future.
Thank you so much.
Right.
Thank you for your kind words.
Right.
Dr. Suresh.
Congratulations once again, Dr. Rabi, and thank you.
No more questions? David Metzger, please go ahead.
Thank you for a fascinating presentation. I'm interested in the possibility of thinking back to your chart where you had distant time, local place, universal space, local time, distance place. I'm interested in whether or not there could be, I'm going to call it a kind of chronotope that is sort of embedded or figured by the very terms that you're mapping into this kind of discursive space. What prompts that wonder is I was thinking in terms of the notion of universal space, for example. I immediately thought perhaps if we think of universal, if we were to relate it to a kind of, I'll say, a scientific discourse, I was thinking, okay, what universal doesn't necessarily mean global. It doesn't even necessarily mean something apart from what you would identify as either a Euclidean or a non-Euclidean space. Yeah.
Right.
And then so that the relationship between universal space and what we could call local space within, I say a scientific framework, because I was thinking more in terms, specifically in terms of, let's say contemporary physics. That the dynamics between the local and the non-local within the scientific discourse would, how would I put it? Within each of these terms, which you could embed science within modernity if you like, right? or you could embed modernity within science, right?
Mhm.
And so I was thinking, but does that mark a change in a chronotopic relationship?
I see what you're saying. I think that's a good way of thinking about this. Scientificism, the way I would interpret it, and this is also just an argument from it is based on materialism. That is the material. That is the rationalization of physics, let's say, the mathematics of physics is based on the material relations between the material things. And that is if the laws are universal in the sense that gravity has a set relational concept between those things, rather than global, which is a different concept because it is not virtual. The universal thing is virtual, that is math laws or the equation of the math or the physics aspects are universal because they're virtually the same everywhere, like as an abstract concept, whether it's rationalization, reasoning, this follows this into this x plus y because of the embedded structure x plus y equals z, that x as defined as this, y as defined as this, equals z as defined as this, plus defined as this. Within that rational algorithmic structure, if you want to put it that way, is a virtual construction which is universal by its very nature because it's not based on whether X is in London versus X is in Japan. It's within the inherent innateness of X as a value, as a rational system. That is sort of the scientific method as a hypothesis, if you want to physics like as the mathematical system that's being created. That would make it universal, not necessarily embedded in the modernity schema. Whereas globalism, I would say, is embedded in the modernity schema because of like the global schema as a global universal system of, let's say, Western civilization emerges within the schematization that emerges with modernity. That is, time is abstract, time is universal, time is non-valued, chronotopic time versus kairotic time. It is not essentially different. It is clock time. It's this, and it's always progressive in this way. And that would be the distinction between the universal and the global in a certain way, because it is embedded in a history system, whereas the universal system is a non-material system, and here again, something like a soul would be different versus something as gravity as a universal concept. If we, in the Islamic concept, like the soul, the ruh would be a universal space, but it won't be acknowledged as that outside of the universal space as Islam sees it.
Yeah.
And that is like where the discourse on the cultural dimension of the universality comes in versus the scientific framing, which would deny the soul because it's not material, right? Whereas physics equation
Yeah,
is based on
that's
the
very
material.
exciting. I mean, I even wonder if what you're talking, this uh, method of charting could could be used to speak about certain controversies within scientific communities. I mean, because in terms of special relativity,
Mm-hmm.
and good heavens, I'm a humanities person talking about special
Yeah.
relativity, and immediately put question mark, don't believe what this guy's saying. Of course. With all that said, I mean, there is the, I would say it, there is within the notion of special relativity that the idea that time is local, meaning, and it's materialistic, right? Because time is understood as the relationship between two periodic um, events. You
Right.
can look at it as being two notches on this wheel is related to eight notches in this wheel.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, it can, which is related to a dial, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's you say that's time.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could say it's a pulse of a photon bouncing from one mirror to the next, right? And then you get these wonderful paradoxes or supposed paradoxes where you're wondering, where there's time dilation. There's also space dilation.
Mm-hmm.
All very, I mean, it's local to an inertial frame of reference, right? But, and of course, arguments, will then ensue. I think this is a very exciting technique. To even suggest that maybe there moments, and there are, I know scientists, I think, would be surprised at this, where scientists are speaking at cross purposes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's what I found was, this is again not, I took this method from Mueller and I modified it to take on indexicality function.
Right.
That is, what is this word that we're using, time? What is this pointing to? You're saying the relation between the two particles bouncing, but I'm saying time is the sundial. When I use the word time, I'm indexing the sundial concept. You're using the word time to index the particle concept. And we are talking at cross purposes because we can't get at this common term becoming this thing. And this is a way of making this legible in a way that I thought was legible.
Yeah. Very exciting. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your question, Dr. Matsu.
We have 1 minute left. Any final thoughts? Well, it is 1:15, and I'm so glad we had the opportunity to talk about Bangla. Even though it's a different Bengal that we come from, and this is something my father would never have understood because he is from East Bengal, and because of partition, they sold everything over there and came over to this side, the Hindu-Muslim divide.
Right.
But what's happening today is something very alien to even my father's generation, and he passed away last year. Otherwise, I would probably have invited him to listen to this conversation. Even my father's generation wouldn't have guessed how far we have moved on, how different the two Banglas are today. I don't know if it is sad, if it is good, I don't know what it is, but it is what it is. And thank you all for being here today. It was a very exciting conversation, my chance to revisit the place of my ancestors. And I hope to see you again for our next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for a great conversation. Appreciate it.